Currently, I'm helping to facilitate the SAFE course number 3, and it's on bodhicitta. We're looking at the 3 principal aspects of the path, and specifically this module is on developing bodhicitta. And so in the early weeks, several people have been confronted with their indecision, I guess, about past and future lives. It's come up on the forum and in conversations. And so I thought just to talk a little bit about some of the lines of reasoning that we can use for determining, for investigating for ourselves this idea of past and future rebirths, the idea that our mind is a continuum that goes from life to life. So it's good when we notice that we have doubts about topics like this, that we try to use our wisdom to cut those doubts. If we just leave that doubt constantly in the back of our mind, that becomes afflicted doubt, and it becomes a hindrance to our practice. Of course, it may take us a while to come to some firm conclusion for ourselves, and that's okay. As long as we're honestly investigating, that's not a problem. But when we just leave things and don't try to come to a conclusion, that's when doubt becomes a problem. So there are 4 points that come to my mind when I think about past and future rebirths. The first one is that no one has disproven past and future rebirths. So that's important to take on board. And that's a fact. No one has shown definitively that there is no past life, no future life. All right, so we can put that on our list of things to contemplate. A second point to think about is that we can look to the experiences of reliable teachers, reliable people that we know. For instance, there are, now this is something that is evidence tending towards the fact, or evidence that we can consider to move our minds in the direction of thinking about the possibility of past and future lives. For instance, in the Jataka tales, the Buddha tells a lot about his own past lives, experiences that he had. That's one thing we can consider. We have to ask, well, what would have been the benefit of the Buddha lying about this to us? Did he have a reason to lie to us? There's also a story in the Golden Light Sutra about a previous life of the Buddha when he was a bodhisattva, and he offered his body to the tigress and her 5 cubs, and then revealed to some of his disciples that it was in that previous life as the Buddha that he these 5 ascetics that we hear about, they were the reincarnation of these 5 cubs. In his biography, Freedom into Exile, the Dalai Lama recounts how he was identified as the previous Dalai Lama. And it's a beautiful story about how merchants, actually the regents and some officials disguised themselves as traveling merchants and were guided to the area where he was reborn. And the story, there's actually quite a bit of detail there, but it was common in those days for merchants to stay in the homes of ordinary people as they traveled through Tibet. And so they were usually taken into the kitchen, and that's where the children usually were. And so as these merchants came in, or these disguised merchants came in and sat down in the kitchen, the Dalai Lama was in there, the young Dalai Lama, 3 years old or so. And he sat down, he started grabbing at the mala around the neck of one of the regent, and it had been his mala in a previous life. And he began to speak to these people in a Lhasa dialect, which his family didn't know, and the people in Amdo didn't speak that dialect. So these are pretty good indications that something unusual was going on there. He also was able to identify these people. He knew them from his previous life. There are also stories about Lama Zopa Rinpoche's remembrance of, as a young boy, that he had been the Laudo Lama. He talked about this from a very early age. And as soon as he could begin to walk, he was constantly wanting to go back to his cave. So there are beautiful books written about some of these stories, if you have interest to read them. There's also many books written by Dr. Ian Stevenson and his successor, Jim Tucker. What's interesting about this is that Dr. Stevenson was the head of psychiatry for about 10 years at the University of Virginia before he got interested in doing scientific research on some of these stories that he came in contact with. Mostly they were children in Asian countries. India in particular is where he started. And he wanted to apply scientific rigor to his research to bring some light to this area. And luckily, he got a really big grant from the person who created the Xerox machine, and so he was able to continue his work. And then when he decided to retire, he passed on his work to Dr. Jim Tucker. And I watched a very interesting video of his on YouTube, and he makes a very clear case for the research that they've done there. He says that proofs should be reserved for mathematics. We can't prove past and future rebirths, at least from a scientific point of view. He says, rather, science investigates for the best evidence, but does not give definitive proof. For example, there is strong evidence that cigarettes cause lung cancer, but there's not proof. You can't definitively say that there's a cause and effect relationship. It's the same with medications. Medications are used because research shows that people get better using certain medications than a placebo. That doesn't constitute proof, but rather it constitutes statistical evidence leading towards the case. So Dr. Tucker describes a similar approach to what they're trying to do in their research, what they've tried to do all these years and what they continue doing in their research with children, approaching the work with a scientific attitude. And so he says that this phenomena of past life memories in children provides strong enough evidence, or the cases that they have provide strong enough evidence that consciousness doesn't end with the physical death of the body, but can carry on, and in certain situations can carry on to another life. So they're saying that there is strong enough evidence. They have something like 2,500 very strong cases of all the thousands and thousands of cases they've collected. They have coded them for certain variables, something like 200 variables, to see which would be the strongest cases, and they've come up with 2,500. So that's pretty good evidence. But again, it's just evidence. Then probably the strongest line of reasoning that we can use is the reasoning based on the fact that our mind is a continuum. Another way that we can come to know hidden phenomena like past and future rebirths is by applying logic and reasoning. We can observe that our own mind is impermanent, like observing different thoughts or the different states of mind that come and go throughout the day, or when we're sitting and doing any kind of meditations, especially breathing meditation. So any compounded or impermanent phenomena or object comes about due to causes and conditions. There's no exceptions. And these causes need to be compatible causes, not completely dissimilar causes. Like, for instance, a certain seed gives rise to a similar sprout, a sprout of a similar type that the seed came from. So from a Buddhist point of view, the mind is described as a non-material entity, non-material phenomena. It's not the brain, although it depends on the brain and the nervous system. It's not made of matter. The definition is clear and knowing. It's a clear and knowing phenomena. So since mind has to have a cause, it has to have a compatible cause. It can't come from something that is material, being a non-material entity. And so, as Dharmakirti said very clearly, mind comes from a previous moment of mind. We can observe how the thoughts that we have today are influenced by the thoughts we had maybe this morning or last night or the day before. We can probably come to our own conclusion from our own experience to see how that's true. That who we are today, the thoughts that we have today, are strongly influenced by what happened yesterday. And if we keep tracing that back and back and back, we can see how all of the events of our life actually have contributed to the mind that we have today. And so if we trace all the way back to birth and even all the way back into the womb, where brain activity is already going on, and we could suggest that there's mental activity at that stage as well. If we trace back all the way to the first moment of mind that entered into that combination of sperm and egg, well, where did that first moment of mind come from? From a Buddhist point of view, they say that we can infer that it must have come from a previous moment of mind. So this is one good line of logic and reasoning that we can think about again and again to see if that helps move us towards a conclusion. And then finally, one I find very compelling also is the fact that there are people who have direct perception of their past lives. In In the meditative field, when a person develops very strong concentration, especially serenity or calm abiding in particular, um, and develops a little bit further from that first experience of calm abiding, they say that they have a certain level of clairvoyance. And they actually can know past and future lives. Now, this is subjective. It's not something that we can take out of someone's mind and look at it and say, oh, sure enough, you have clairvoyance of your past lives. But the fact that it's replicable, the fact that it's discussed in many sutras, as well as the shastras and teachings of pandits who have followed the Buddha's teachings, that's another line of inquiry or investigation that we can use to help us come to, or at least move into the direction of doubt tending towards the fact, and perhaps even eventually coming to our own conclusion about this phenomenon of past and future lives. So it's certainly not an easy topic to come to our own conclusion about, but it's one that's worthwhile giving a lot of thought to, not just leaving it as a doubt in our mind. So I hope that's helpful.